No matter how much you love sailing, there's nothing scarier than being stranded 140 miles away from the coast, floating in a dinghy with no provisions, and heading out into the Atlantic Ocean. For 5 crew members, surviving a shipwreck in shark-infested waters would turn a routine boat transfer into the most terrifying moments of their lives. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. When Deborah Kiley greeted Captain John Lippeth, she knew something was strange. John had an impressive resume, contrasting the first impression he left on Debbie. The 24-year-old woman revealed in the U.S. show I Shouldn't Be Alive that John looked like the typical scraggly sailor. He had actually been a skipper on the Black Knight boat, the committee boat for the America's Cup, so he definitely had to possess some pretty amazing skills. However, another aspect caught Debbie's attention. John liked to celebrate everything. From the moment they first met, he wanted to grab a beer to cheer on their collaboration. The next person Debbie met in the port was Meg Mooney, John's girlfriend. Brad Kavanaugh was the youngest member of the crew. A yachtsman, he joined in on the journey because he knew Debbie and trusted her. He then brought up one of his friends, an English sailor named Mark Adams. With their crew now complete, they started their mission. They had to take the Trash Man, a 58-foot luxury yacht from Bar Harbor, Maine, all the way to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Debbie was the most experienced for sure. In 1981, she was the first American woman to complete the Whitbread Round the World race, a yacht race around the world held every 3 or 4 years since 1973. She took up sailing at a very young age and began working on yachts as a teenager. Meanwhile, John's impressive resume was overshadowed by his drinking problem. Brad's only experience in sailing came from sailing his family's yacht. Mark was a mystery tour, and Meg was definitely not a sailor. A strange crew indeed. On day 1, the weather looked lovely, and the boat was fun to steer, so Debbie was in heaven. She was looking forward to the 1,300-mile trip, but on the second day, the weather took a turn for the worse. The blue sky darkened and a storm was looming on the horizon, while Debbie was taking a much-deserved nap. All of a sudden, Brad wakes her up. He tells her a violent storm hit the Trash Man with 68-mile-per-hour winds and 30-foot waves. Not used to the boat's movements, Meg, who was on the deck, fell and slashed open her leg. As the boat was taking on water, Debbie and Brad rushed to Meg's side to try to help her. The powerful waves and the wind pushed the boat from side to side until eventually the sails are ripped apart. Seeing that, John tries to turn on the engine without success. That was their last chance to head back to safety. Suddenly, a huge wave breaks underneath the boat, causing the vessel to be in a free fall. As soon as the boat lands on the water, all the windows break. The boat is now sinking fast. The crew tries to get to the life raft and the survival kit they prepared beforehand, but nothing seems to go their way. Instead, Brad sees a tiny dinghy and throws it into the water. The 5 crew members jump into the water in order to get away from the sinking yacht. In a matter of seconds, the waves swallow the boat and they're left stranded in the middle of the ocean. On the next day, the overcast sky and the freezing temperatures raised a new danger: hypothermia. First, the crew tries to huddle underneath the 11-foot dinghy, but the thick air caused John to have chest pains, so they decided to turn over the dinghy and get up in it. Meg was the first one to be lifted up into the dinghy. The deep cut on her leg was still bleeding. John and Brad join her, while Debbie and Mark try to get under the dinghy again to warm up. Mark, with his sharp tongue, immediately yells at Debbie to stop kicking him. Debbie insists she's not that close to him, so she can't be touching him. Mark continues, so Debbie decides to look in the water to prove him wrong. As soon as she goes underwater, she's hit with this intense, eerie feeling like she's being watched. In the distance, she notices a few torpedo-shaped bodies. Meg's bloody wound managed to catch the attention of hundreds of hungry sharks that were now circling the dinghy. Debbie yelled, "Shark!" and the crew dragged her and Mark into the dinghy before the sharks could reach them. Everyone was in shock, especially Deborah. She had never seen that many sharks before in her life, not even when she sailed across the world in 1981. Hundreds of shark fins filled the water that surrounded the dinghy, and for the next few days, the 5 crew members needed to keep as far away as possible from them. On the 3rd day, the sharks started to bump into the dinghy, trying to turn it over so they could have their feast. The animals played a weird game with the crew. The sharks would go away from time to time, but just when the crew thought they were safe, the predators would come back again to taunt them. Every moment was a real-life horror movie, especially when John and Mark became delirious. By day 4, now suffering from infection and starvation, the 2 men started drinking water straight from the ocean. This only led them to become more dehydrated and delirious, to the point that John now thinks he's seeing his car in the parking lot. The others try to convince him that it's just an illusion, but they lack the energy to keep him from jumping into the ocean. As soon as he dove in, he disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind a blood-curdling scream. Dozens of shark fins are seen bolting toward John. They dragged him under the dinghy and ripped him apart bit by bit, their movements causing the boat to sway. Soon there was nothing left of him, only blood mixing with salt water under everyone's eyes and silence. The sharks had just claimed their first victim. Just a few hours later, in the middle of another delirious episode, Mark got up and announced to the crew that he was going to 7-Eleven to buy bread and cigarettes. Brad and Debbie tried to stop him, but he insisted he needed to stretch his legs and that he'd be back soon. So he jumped into the water. The splashes alerted the sharks that another victim had fallen into the water. With incredible speed, the ocean's deadliest predators swam toward Mark and clamped their massive jaws around him. His screams sent chills down the remaining crew's spines. The sea turned red from the blood, but the attack was far from over. As they ripped flesh from bone, the sharks tried to tip the dinghy once more. Deborah let out a terrifying scream as she held onto the boat. All she could think of is how it would feel to be bitten by a shark. She decided then and there that she didn't want to find out. On day 5, Debbie and Brad wake up to Meg's dead body. The 2 remaining crew members take off her shirt and jewelry to give to her family on the return and hold a sort of funeral for her before slowly pushing her into the water. Once again, Debbie and Brad looked over to the horizon and saw tens of sharks swimming fast toward them, attracted by Meg's body. In one last terrifying moment, Brad fell into the water while trying to clean the boat out. Unable to find the strength to pull him back in, Deborah breaks down. "I felt like I just doomed Brad to death," she said. "If the sharks came back, he was dead." With a surge of adrenaline, Brad managed to pull himself in, and moments later, desperation turned to joy as he spotted a Russian cargo ship on the horizon. They waved desperately at the ship, and just like that, they were saved. According to Debbie, she didn't care who those people were or where they were going. "I was there, and Brad was there, and we were alive." After 5 days lost at sea, stalked by ferocious sharks and watching their friends die in the most brutal fashion, Deborah Scaling Kiley and Brad Kavanaugh had managed to survive. However, they never got out of survival mode. They kept living in it.